Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event brought to you by the volunteers of the IET in Surrey. And today we're going to be looking at a very important topic which will affect all of us in the coming years. Now, as the advancement of global warming becomes obvious even to the most entrenched climate change deniers, the urgent need to cut CO2 emissions and secure the future of our planet is clear. However, producing green technologies like electric cars will use vast quantities of our natural resources, not only in production, but also to keep them charged. So over the next few decades, global supply of raw materials must drastically change to accommodate that transformation to a low-carbon economy. Hence the resource challenges of going green, the title of our talk today. The role of scientists is to provide the evidence for how best to move towards a zero carbon economy. But with that, society needs to better understand that there is a raw material cost of going green, and both new research and investment is urgently needed to evaluate new ways to source these. Potentially that may include considering sources much closer to where the metals are to be used, for example. And both of those aspects are covered in the following talk. So today our speaker is Professor Richard Herrington. He's currently leading research on the green economy theme at the UK's renowned Natural History Museum. He's been a key member of the team of scientists leading the prestigious interdisciplinary Security of Supply of Mineral Resources program, focusing on the science needed to sustain the security of supply of strategic materials in a changing environment. In 2020, Richard, along with other key members of the group, delivered a letter to the UK Committee on Climate Change to highlight their concerns. So exactly what are the challenges in sustainably and environmentally sourcing the materials we'll all be using in the future, so that we avoid swapping carbon for some other form of planet-harming processes? Over to you, Richard.
Well, no, thank you very much. You're very welcome, and I'm very pleased to talk about something that's been close to my heart since the late 2010s, when we set ourselves these enormous challenges to decarbonize our industry and transport. So happy to be speaking to you tonight.
And what a magnificent background you've got there of the Natural History Museum. So you had to use a fisheye lens to fit it all in.
Yes, that's right. Fisheye lens to get it in, and I'll try not to look like I've got horns, but yeah, it's based in those buildings in London, and I'll give you a little bit of a background as to why I should be based there talking about minerals, which is one of the first things people ask me.
Okay, well, without further ado then, it'll be over to you, and feel free to share your screen whenever you wish. Great.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I will do that. I will share my screen. Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us this evening. So yeah, thanks very much, Nigel, for the very kind introduction. I'm just going to introduce myself a bit, really. I am based at the Natural History Museum. I've been there since 1991, actually. And you might ask, why would someone from the Natural History Museum be talking about mineral supply? Well, the museum, you probably know, is a fantastic visitor attraction. We have a collection of over 80 million specimens, which includes 185,000 mineral specimens of many types. So effectively, we've got a systematically collected natural collection of the world's mineral diversity. And we've based research around these for many years. And there's over 300 research scientists at the Natural History Museum, and including my small group who work on the origins and of mineral deposits, of minerals that are of economic interest and useful and for technological development. So that's basically where the reason that we're based there. We have in the basement of this fine building behind me, we have a very advanced mineralogical analysis infrastructure. So very much have a strong science basis for our research work. As Nigel alluded to, I have connections with Imperial College where I teach and also University of Exeter. So the museum is very much integrated as part of the academic network in the UK, as well as being a public museum. Okay, yes. So just to say that the museum is actually just going through quite a major change itself, and we've secured future funding from the government to build a sister site really in the Thames Valley and Thames Valley Science Park with the University of Reading. So this gives us new opportunities to build closer links with external partners. So very much the museum is a very outward-looking institution, as well as being a public museum. So enough of the advertisement and explanation. Let's move on to the what I'm beginning to talk about. And actually, Nigel alluded to this. In 2019, you may remember the Committee on Climate Change in the UK brought out this net zero report, which you can see on the left here. And it was to sort of highlight what would the UK's contribution to stopping global warming be. And within there, at the bottom there, there's a paragraph: by 2035, at the latest, all new cars should be electric. If possible, an earlier switchover would be desirable. So that kind of set the scene. And at the time, I thought, well, I'll sit down and just do the calculation of what it would cost us to transform 31.5 million small road vehicles that we have, that are all internal combustion engine, turning all of those into electric vehicles. And on the right-hand side there, you'll see the letter that I led a bunch of us who all felt the same, that really the government hadn't considered the implications of what they were saying. And as you probably remember, in shortly following up from that report, the then Prime Minister announced legislation that would cover this target of being net zero by 2050. And inherent in that is this fact that we would have to transform our energy, power generation and transport by 2035 and 2050. So enormous challenges. And at the time, just did the quick sums there, and it was going to take twice the world's annual production of cobalt, pretty much all of the neodymium and dysprosium, and about 12% extra production of copper on the world market, just for the United Kingdom. And when you think there's more than 1 billion vehicles worldwide, for the planet to do it, there's an enormous need there. So that was really where I started and started to come from. And as a result of writing that letter, of course, you get asked to do jobs. And so the nub of that, I have been involved as an advisor. I'm on the Critical Minerals Advisory Committee for BEIS, and actually government has listened and are taking on board some of those the worrying implications that we have. And I'm going to talk a bit about those now, talk about some of the mitigations, and then put in there some of the warnings about what should we be worried about with this transition that's going on. And actually we should really be keeping our eye on the ball, because it's incredibly easy for us to drop the ball in this time and not be able to deliver those targets that we've already committed to. So moving on, it became bigger, and obviously in the recent years, 2021, we had the net zero strategy document that was published by HM government, which set that out. And by that time, they had recognised the need for minerals in that. Pleased to hear that they'd listened to us, and they'd put that into the documentation. And they'd stuck to the goals of decarbonising the power system and transport system would be moving over to all electric as from 2035. So what is the scope of the issue here for that pledge to decarbonize? Well, if we have a look at where anthropogenic CO2 is being produced, and CO2 is not the worst of the warming gases, but it's the most common cause of the increase in warmth. You probably know that methane is worse, and there are some other gases that are even more problematic. But by far and away, it's carbon dioxide that's a problem. And if we look at the current producers of carbon dioxide, you'll see the biggest one is electricity and heat. So energy generation using fossil fuels and producing carbon dioxide. But there's another huge chunk there for transportation, 21% there from industry. And actually things like residential, our own home heating, and is only about 6%. And other sectors would just include things like hospitals and all of those other things that really are kind of unavoidable. But you see the big chunks there, electricity and heat, and transportation. And these were kind of the number one agenda that government could actually sort out with legislation. And then obviously industry are being driven to decarbonize because of punitive taxation on carbon generation. So in place there are key drivers to make that happen. So let's try and pull apart what that means with regard to use of resources. So there's a switch to renewable generation of electricity, number one, and the decarbonising of transport. And I'm going to talk about those because they're that's more than 60% of the CO2 emission. So if we have a look at energy intensity of the carbon intensity of energy consumption, this is a map up for 2022, and it's data you can freely get on the web if you want to. And what we've got there is a map where data is available of the carbon intensity of energy generation around the world. Basically, the greener the colour, the greener you are, and the black means that you're burning lots of fossil fuels. So the darker the shade of brown or black, the higher emitter you are. And you can see the UK in 2022 is doing quite well. We're sort of beige going green, and France has gone green, and that's no surprise really, because they have a lot of nuclear energy. So the carbon intensity of their energy production is actually quite low. And on the left here, you'll see a little diagram which shows that in detail of some of these countries. So, for example, France has a carbon intensity that's about half of the UK, and that is because of its reliance on nuclear power. But if you look at Great Britain, we are doing quite well on a world scale. We are better than a lot of our European colleagues, and that is because we have migrated. We're getting a lot of our energy generated by renewables, by wind turbines particularly. So upwards of 30 to 40% on some days is coming from wind power. And obviously we can do better, and we've got to move. We set ourselves targets to get below 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour of generation. And that means we've still got to halve what we're doing now. So we've got to get more and more of the gas out of our system and bring in things that are carbon neutral or even carbon negative if we can. But straight away, UK has done very, very well on moving to renewable, particularly to wind power, and we've implemented a lot. But we're going to look to treble what we've got, and just looking at each wind turbine, and I've got a little diagram here that shows each of those wind turbines and what's in it. So every wind turbine has about 1,200 tons of concrete, more than 335 tons of steel, 4.7 tons of copper, And then a whole load of rare earths, like 2 tons of rare earths, aluminium, and other metals like zinc and molybdenum. So that's the amount for a 3 megawatt turbine. So you can see that is made of metal. And you think that's a 3 megawatt turbine. So to build a renewable power station that's as big as a nuclear power station, you're going to need thousands of these. And the amount of metal in those becomes, you can start to see what the problem might be. Okay, so we talked about transport. Transport also needs to move from fossil fuels. And it's true, electric vehicles do make sense if they're recharged with low CO2 electricity. So here we've got a graph, and it's from the IEA study in 2022, that shows you on the left-hand side, you've got the battery electric vehicle. So the total CO2 output of a battery electric vehicle in its whole life cycle, compared on the bar on the right-hand side, is for an internal combustion engine car. So you can see the base of building the car, the manufacturing, they're quite similar. So the green part of it, the amount of energy to manufacture an electric car versus an internal combustion engine car. There's a bit more for building batteries. And you'll see the electricity is another, obviously, use, because there will be a carbon cost in that, even if it's renewable. But when you compare that to the amount that a car will use over its life cycle with internal combustion engine, you can see it's you're halving your carbon footprint at least by having an electric vehicle. So we've got that sort of, we're happy with that. But as I said, going completely green is a mineral hungry business. So these are IEA figures, again, from 2021. What you can see in red are the conventional the conventional technologies. So what I've highlighted on the top part here is the amount of metal needed for a conventional car. So at the top there, you can see there's on a scale of kilograms of metal per vehicle, of specialty metals per vehicle, conventional car has about 45 kilos. But when you get to an electric car, we've got more than 220 kilos of specialist metals, and that includes a whole range, including graphite as well, in the batteries. And it's a similar thing for generating power from power stations. I mentioned the fact that each wind turbine takes quite a lot of metal, and because we've got a large number of turbines being built, and it's the same for photovoltaic cells for solar panels, there's a lot of infrastructure has to be built. You have to build cabling between the individual units. Each of those units is made of more metal, whereas a coal-fired power station was quite compact. You needed a certain amount of metal to build that, and you can see on the bars on the bottom of this chart that the amount of metals to build a coal-fired power station and a natural gas power station are very much smaller, much reduced compared to solar, photovoltaic, and wind turbine systems. So going green, no getting away from it. It's a mineral hungry business. So we're getting away from having to mine coal or take hydrocarbons out of the ground, but it's beginning to look like we're going to need a lot of metal for that transition. And it's not only for those speciality metals, as I've shown you there. When we compare just the basic infrastructure for that power generation, it's going to need a lot more of the more common or garden metals and minerals. So if we compare here, the conventional, again, we show it here in red. The bars there are showing the amount of things like steel, glass, aluminium, concrete, and copper needed for coal and gas power stations. Relatively small amount per megawatt when you compare it to hydropower or wind. And you can see there, concrete particularly. And that's because each one of those turbines has a 1,200 tons of concrete holding it on the seabed or on the ground. And likewise, the photovoltaics, they need to be built on with infrastructure. And you can see a large amount of steel and copper also, particularly in photovoltaics, because each one of those has to be connected with power cables. So it shows you that even the use of the more basic metals is going to increase as well. And I mean, just in its broadest sense, what we've seen with our technology change, and it's gone not only with energy, but all the other technologies that we're using, you know, our sort of communication systems, the more sophisticated things like aeroplanes, the satellites and so on. These are using not only more materials, but they're using a broader range of materials. And what we're going deeper into the periodic table. So we're going to use elements that before we learnt about doing chemistry, but now we're actually using them on a semi or fully industrial scale. And this rather clever little graph shows how, you know, from 1700, we were probably only using 3 major elements, you know, carbon for coal and for timber, for calcium in our limestone for building stones and mortar, and iron for, you know, nuts and bolts and nails and so on. And of course, now if we go to the far right here, we're using a large number of elements from the periodic table. And so I've talked about I've highlighted some of those elements that where we're going to need lots of them, but there's a whole raft of different elements that are needed for that energy transition, and I've just put them on this on this little diagram there, and you can read them at your leisure. And just really to tell people, everybody gets sort of focused on rare earths, but it's not just rare earths, as you can see. It's everything, depending on the sort of technologies we're putting there. And we are putting all of these, we're going to be building at scale. So for solar panels, it's a range of minor metals like gallium and indium. And obviously for hydrogen, which is the alternative if we don't want to use battery electric, but we use fuel cell electric, we're going to be using platinum group metals in fuel cells. Obviously batteries, there's a cocktail of materials needed there. But we're also going to need alloys because, you know, one of the things you probably notice about electric vehicles is they're heavier because they've got more metal in them. So the more and more push to get lighter alloys into those vehicles to reduce the weight of them, and that's meaning more of those sort of speciality metals. So if we quantify what that might be in the way of needs, and again, the World Bank report in 2020 came up with some rather nice figures on that. These are actually quite conservative, I'll be honest. But what it shows is things like graphite, lithium, and cobalt are going to have their annual demand for supply increased by 500% at least. And there's a range of other things in there, like indium, which is used in is a specialist in photovoltaics and touch screens and all sorts like that. Vanadium for static battery storage, nickel, obviously, but even things like silver, lead, increasing using lead because it's used in solders and things like that. So we have much more electrical connections and so on. So that's the percentage increases, but actually there's a small increase in percentage of aluminium, but that translates in the graph on the right-hand side to quite a large volume. It's actually several millions of tons of aluminium metal per year. And actually, overall, between now and 2050, we're going to have to mine another total year's production of aluminium. So, and that's that's an enormous amount, because it's not a minor metal. It's mined in large quantities. So increasing demands for a range of metals, and in the case of some, it's going from a very low base, and so that's why they've got some massive percentage increases. Things like lithium and cobalt are going through the roof in percentage terms. Okay, well, lots of people say, well, why do we need, you're telling us about mining, but I thought mining was something that we used to do, but can't we if we're just more careful with what we've got, can we not just use things in a circular economy, reuse what we've already taken out of the ground? And we hear this a lot. And it's absolutely true. We shouldn't be moving away from the linear economy where we take something out of the ground, we make something out of it, and then we throw it away. I mean, I think we're all learning that there is no away. When you're throwing things away, someone's got to do something with it. And we don't want to throw our plastics down into the ocean. We don't want our plastics to go into landfill. We want to reuse them and recycle. And effectively, we should be minimizing waste. That's absolutely correct. And so we should be moving towards a circular economy. And that sounds absolutely terrific. So what are the chances that we can do all of this by just recycling? Well, this is some analysis that I did. What you see on this, on the x-axis, you see a range of commodities. They're mostly metals, but there's graphite at the end there, which obviously is a form of carbon. It's mined as a mineral. What's shown in orange there is the percentage of the end-of-life material that is currently recycled. So basically, how much of that metal is recycled rather than go to scrap? And the orange bar shows you that for some metals, we're pretty good. So cobalt, we managed to recycle about 70% of what in things that come to the end of their life. Titanium and chromium were even better. And things like iron were up to 80%. I mean, scrap metal is good about how it's being recycled. But in blue there is the current demand, the percentage of the current demand that is met by the recycled stream. And you'll see that is where the mismatch comes. So for cobalt, we recycle 70%, but that 70% is only giving us 30% of what we actually need. So we need another 70% of new cobalt. And it's the same for every one of the metals on that graph, apart from indium. So indium's really strange. There seems to be a lot of stock of indium that has just come onto supply. And that's because a lot of it was stockpiled because it was produced as a byproduct. So that's a sort of an anomalous one. But there's some really worrying ones, like graphite. We don't recycle it. And so that's why we have none to put back in the recycle chain. It's the same for lithium and vanadium. So there's absolutely no way we can use the circular economy argument for those particular metals. And as it looks on the graph there aren't many of the metals that we could call upon recycling to give us what we need. Lead is the metal that comes the closest. And that really is because we don't really throw lead away, and the market for lead is only growing quite slowly. So it's the one that's closest to being a totally circular economy. So it's really only by 2040 will recycling become significant for many of these materials. And you'll see here the graphs again show this from the IEA 2021 that's when we can expect things to be getting back into being reused. And many of the batteries that are going into vehicles now won't come up for recycling for another 10, 15 plus years. So that makes sense. And so even we can't expect those to be part of the recycling scheme till 2040. Well, how about waste? I mean, we've got quite a lot of waste, industrial wastes, old mine dumps, these kind of things. And there's been quite a bit of work done on those. And this is some of the output from work that was done in 2019 for a European Union report. But you can see for some of these things, we're looking here that on the y-axis here, it's the number of tons that have been located in waste streams. But for something like cobalt, it's only 10,000 tons. And since we're upwards needing 100,000 tons a year, it's probably only about 10% of what we need. So for some of these other elements, it's even lower than that. You go down to platinum, there's probably only about 8 tons that seems to have been thrown away. Well, that's good news. I think it's because it's so valuable, it doesn't get thrown away. But it's just showing you that only for things like fluorspar, maybe, for silicon, we might well be able to go to the wastes for some of those. But then you're talking of maybe only 10,000 tons for silicon, which again is only a small amount of the demand. And so actually, again, waste isn't there to come out alone, feed the need, if you like. And that's really, going back to that, why is that happening? Well, because the world is growing economically. And so what we're seeing here on this map of the world, it's showing you the countries, basically the darker red, the higher the growth. So we can see countries like Mongolia, China. This is only data up until 2019. We've gone through a bit of a recession and dive through the COVID, but we are coming back out of this. And pretty much the entire world is growing. And that means growth in demand. So we can't expect the likes of India that's growing. We can't ask them to wait until we recycle before they put electric wires into their villages. They want those materials now. And so that is driving the demand that we saw, where there is this gap between the amount in the recycle chain and the amount that we actually need. So more mining is definitely needed. But where is that going to come from? That's a big challenge. So what we come to the conclusion is that we'd love to have a circular economy, but what we need is a circular economy that at the moment needs to be fed with new material that's mined. And then the other thing that we've got is currently, you'll see these funny little arrows coming off this diagram. Actually, the circular economy folk don't like this picture because it's just, we actually have waste at every part of the life cycle of minerals. It's an unfortunate thing. We should be moving towards minimizing that waste, but currently it's quite leaky and we lose waste all the way along that supply chain. Hopefully we can help to close that loop so that we don't leak waste. We're able to put everything that we use back into the reuse and the recycle. But currently at the moment, we need that circular economy to be stocked with new materials that we don't have in the recycling stream. So there's some problems with that, and I'm going to now highlight the problems that we've got. Well, one of the biggest problems is that we've got geographic monopolies for these minerals, and you've probably heard a lot about how China controls a lot of the raw materials that we want to use. And you can see here, like the rare earths and graphite, China is controlling most of the supply of those. We've got cobalt coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you've probably heard about some issues there with potentially with child labor and so on. And it's not the most stable country on the planet. We've got some things like lithium where Australia and Chile control supply. Probably we're less worried about Australia as a place to get our minerals from. Chile also is pretty stable. And then we've got South Africa for platinum, Indonesia for nickel. So what I'm saying is that, we look at minerals, there's much more geographic monopolistic control over minerals than ever there has been for oil. And of course, we got really quite worried, didn't we, over the late last year, over the Christmas period, because such a lot of our natural gas is coming from Russia. And the fact that Russia's supply was cut off really squeezed the cost of gas. Well, we're all suffering still. So just imagine if something happened with China or South Africa or the DRC. Even if we wanted to increase those amounts of materials from those places, they would be cut off from us. And this is the sort of number one problem that's hanging there. It's a bit like only having one supermarket where you can buy food from, and suddenly that supermarket goes bust. You've got no shop to go to. You want to have diversity. You want to have a secure supply chain, which is sprinkled across a number of countries. I mean, copper's quite a good example. That's quite well spread between 3 countries. You know, even if China wanted to cut off some copper, we've got other countries supplying. And as I said, lithium was similar. Nickel is similar. So not nearly so bad for some of those metals. But for others, we definitely need to look for diversity of supply. Another problem we have is that opening new mines often has a long lead time. Now, our politicians have committed us to things like 2035 and 2050, and we need a lot of new metal. This diagram shows you here the lead time, the average lead time for the time from finding, discovering, and then putting into production a particular mine. So at the top there, this is a global average for an average mine around the world. It takes about 12 and a half years to do your exploring, discover it, and do a feasibility study that says that's worth mining. It takes another 1.5 years at least to get the construction and planning sorted out. And then it's another 2.5 to get the construction to the production and get it running. So it's about 17 or 18 years on average for a mine. And if we have a look at the bottom graph there, it can be quite short for some types of mine, like lithium. Really easy to get a lithium brine mine into production, maybe 4 years. But copper and nickel, where it's quite complicated, they need lots of permits and all of those things, it takes a long time to get those into production. So copper that we're looking for today, we won't even get that into production until 2040. And if we're saying we need all of this stuff by 2050, we're giving ourselves not much time if we don't keep pushing to find new resources that we can mine. So we need to expand the places we look for minerals. So currently this diagram shows us where in the world are people spending money looking for minerals. It's produced by the Mining Association of Canada, which is why Canada is shown in a brown. And Canada takes the biggest chunk of money for exploring for minerals. And that's because Canada's a very mining-friendly country. You know, their history is kind of built on prospectors and mining. And so they've got really a good infrastructure that's very pro-mining, very good regulation, as I say, it's well regulated, and mining generally has a good press in that country and things, which is why companies spend money there. Other parts of the world, they are spending by far much smaller amounts. So if you look at Africa, which is a huge place, a huge potential for mineral resources, much more potential than Canada itself, and it's only getting the same amount of money. And places like Central Asia, which again has got huge potential, only about 1% of the world's exploration money goes in there. So we can get better. We can go and look in some different places to be more successful. We also know we're clever as geologists. We can find new deposits, so we can find new things. So it's not all doom and gloom. this is a new deposit of lithium and boron. So lithium we need big time. And this was a huge discovery under our noses in Serbia, right in Europe, and right under these farming fields in Serbia. Now, there's a problem there because of environmental concerns, but nevertheless, it just goes to show that we can actually discover new mineral deposits. And so we hopefully, if we should be able to put in place mechanisms to enable these discovered deposits to be put into production in enough time to be able to hit those targets I talked about. And we can look deeper. So this graph shows you there's a timeline along the x-axis, and the y-axis is depth below surface. And the little dots are where deposits were found geographically with respect to the Earth's surface. So you can see all the way from 1900 up to about 1960, the deposits were found within 500 meters of the Earth's surface. That's because we didn't have the technology to go and look down deep. We had plenty of places to go and look at deposits that might be sitting exposed on the Earth's surface. What we need to do is to start to go deeper, and we have started to do that. So since the 1960s, people have gone deeper, but we're still finding lots and lots of deposits at the surface. But I think what that shows you is that there should equally be opportunity at depth, and we need to be exploring much more deeply, and companies are beginning to do that. But as you can imagine, the technologies for going deeper are that much trickier, and the timelines to get a deep mine into production versus one at the surface are longer. So again, we've got to work quickly to find where they might be. So we're learning to find deposits undercover. But since 2000, only 9 of 239 discoveries have been deeper than 500 meters. And I've said there, 7 of these are brownfields. What do I mean by brownfields? It means we find the deposits very close to where there is an existing mine. And actually, that's been a really good philosophy. And there's good examples of this around the world where that's happened. So this is an example in Ireland. It's the Tara zinc mine, which is actually in a very nice rural part of Ireland. You wouldn't really notice there is a zinc mine there if you visited. It's just a few buildings at the surface. It's a great example of how mining can be done really well under people's noses in a very mature European country. And what's happened there is that using oil seismic technologies, the company's been able to look deeper under the deposit, and they have found new resources. So there is, in this case, they've been able to unlock something at depth. I mean, this is a real win-win situation, because it means that a mine that was going to close, a very successful mine that was going to close, has suddenly got a completely new lease of life. So that's got to be good news for the local people, for their for employment and so on, but also good news for supplying metals for this green transition. We've also got some opportunities that are coming up, which are very controversial. Mining might be able to move to the ocean floor. So the deep ocean, you've probably read, there is potential to be mining some of those metals in the deep ocean. And so they include, this is on the map on the left-hand side, shows you locations on the deep ocean floor where old fossil volcanoes are preserved, where there are mineral deposits that have formed actually on the ocean floor through a process of hydrothermal venting on the sea floor, something called black smokers. You may have heard about these. We've got analogues of those in the geological record, but what it means is that there are metal deposits that are formed on the sea floor that are waiting there on the surface of the ocean floor to be mined. On the right-hand side, this shows a map which highlights the Central Pacific, where we have these fields of polymetallic nodules, which you may have heard called manganese nodules. And again, these are huge resources of metals that potentially could offer the opportunity to supply a lot of that shortfall of metal that we need. So if we just look at the reserves in one of these parts of the ocean where you've got these nodules, there's at least 10 years of the world's copper production, 300 years of the manganese we might need, and 450 years of the cobalt we need sitting there on the ocean floor. The issue there is this is a pristine, deep ocean environment. There's a lot of environmental concerns about the effect on the biology in the deep ocean. And again, that's something where we need to come to terms with. Do we go down the deep ocean floor, or do we push to get more of our metals in terrestrial sub-aerial systems? You may have heard about this too, the last resort, if you like, and that's final frontier of mining, asteroids. But, that's not going to happen in my lifetime, and probably nobody listening to this is going to happen in their lifetime. That is something for the future, but it won't be there for 2050. So the debate about where our new minerals should be coming from is very complex. So there's pros and cons of deep ocean floor, whether we do it in rainforest, terrestrial, in national parks. It's for society just to decide. I don't think we can say we're not going to mine in any particular environment just for that. We need to have real reasons why we choose the place we mine. We have to compare each of the sites. We have to decide, once we need those metals, then we've got to decide as a society where they might come from. And one of the things I controversially mentioned in a paper in 2021 was, why don't we start looking for minerals again closer to home? We had the history of mining, the graph on the right-hand side. It's something I published in 2013. There's metals that have been mined in Europe for the first industrial revolution. We've got out of the habit of mining because we've exported the mining to other parts of the world. But how about this? Why don't we try and use some of those deposits closer to home? We could look after the governance of those mines better. We could clean up some of the old mine sites that have left problems. And in the process, we could be restoring some of those sites to make them much more biodiversity rich. And so there's great opportunity in going back to some of these old mining districts. So I posed that out as one of the answers. And in fact, that's happening in Cornwall. You probably know Southwest England historically was great tin mining. Those of you who watch Poldark and will know there's a great romance behind that. But there was a big tin industry, and it was at the time as valuable as the gold mining industry in Canada has been to Ontario. So it was historically very significant. But what's happening is that there's a new resurgence of a look, because what turns out is that there are lots of the metals were left behind. In the case of the Herrington mine near Plymouth, it's tungsten, which is used for a lot of our high technology uses. But down there right in southwest England, in the heart of tin country, there's a lot of lithium that's been discovered that's sitting there in the granites. And a lot of that lithium is sitting in old mines that were mined for kaolin or for tin. The lithium was never taken out, and it's sitting there and it's being reevaluated. And actually, it's got some good potential. And you know what? Mining is actually looked on positively down in Cornwall. So one of the companies, Cornish Lithium, did some crowdsourcing for their project. And the fundraising sold out within 15 minutes, local people buying shares in a company that was proposing to do mining. But I think people realise there that mining can be a good thing if it's done correctly. Similarly, near Plymouth, the tungsten mine there is going to be reopening, and hopefully that is looked upon positively. And then, I've got another example here, which is in northern Sweden. There's an iron ore mine where it was threatened with closure because the mine had got so close to the town. In fact, you can see here's the town very close to the edge of the pit. The people in the town voted to move the town several kilometers to the east to allow the mine to expand, because everybody's livelihood depended on the mining. But we do know that other parts of the world, mining is not so well received. In France, absolutely no chance of mines being put into production at the moment, because people feel that that is very detrimental to their livelihood. Similarly, in Serbia, where Rio Tinto found that big new lithium deposit, ironically, the people in Serbia are suffering because of the big lignite mines that are fueling their power stations, but they don't want lithium mining to produce electric vehicles. And somehow I think we're getting these sort of messages all mixed up. And it kind of, the last bit of my talk is to just quickly mention that one of the problems of the mineral supply and mining has been in the past is we've not done this stuff very well. We haven't done the environmental stuff very well. We've not done the social stuff. We've not engaged with people. And we've not governed the mining companies well enough to get them to make sure when they recover these minerals and do the mining, that it is beneficial for the people, the social, and the planet, the environmental. And so actually, if we're going to have this, and you can look at the COP26 messaging, it was, we're desperately needing to keep our temperature increase within reach, as they say. The only way we can do that is to accelerate the transition to clean energy. But by doing that, what we don't want to create is a problem because we've exploited and made really terrible mining decisions. So we need to make sure we have sustainable land use even after the mining is finished. And that's going to need innovative science. And we've got to embrace both of those targets. So we've got to go for the net zero. We've got to mine things because we need those metals for the net zero challenge. But we've got to make sure that the new type of mining is done in a way that is net positive. And so one of the things that I've been working on is trying to get mining to think of a new philosophy and go to a sort of a circular economy for a mine, which we were using a phrase that was coined by some other writers as cradle to cradle philosophy, where, and the two pictures up here demonstrate that you go in and you mine your metals. This is a copper mine that was in Wisconsin. So again, this is Rio Tinto. They went in there, they mined the copper. It made several $1 billion worth of profit. But they went back and they remediated that mine site, rehabilitated it, and it's become a net positive nature reserve. It's got a small industrial site, and it's a recreational park for people. And all of that was done, and the salmon fishermen in that river were able to fish salmon. So it can be done. And if, the mining companies would look at what they're going to do when they finish the mining and cast the plan of the mine, of the post-mining landscape before they do the mining, we could start to shorten that permitting period, because people would be encouraging the mining, a bit like they are in Cornwall, and those mining projects could be shortened so they wouldn't take 20 years to get into production. We could get those done more quickly, and we could actually hopefully hit those targets. And then kind of a last couple of thoughts. Biodiversity, intactness, we should be making sure that we increase biodiversity. What this diagram shows is the red areas are where humans have degraded biodiversity. So actually, to bring mining into Cornwall is not going to degrade biodiversity anymore. And in fact, what we can do is use post-mining to improve that landscape. So there's a real benefit to going into brownfields, to old industrial sites, and doing a new set of mining in a better way that then leads us to an improved impact, rather than going looking for minerals in new greenfield sites in the middle of rainforests. We need to tackle the energy consumption of the mining business. Modern mining is quite energy intensive, but mining companies are driving down the use of energy. And one of the ways they're doing that is to bring in new technologies. And one of the technologies my group are working on is how can we use nature to help with the mining and indeed with the mining cleanup. And so what we've been using is naturally sourced bacteria and fungi from the natural environment that can accelerate mineral reactions, and we can actually use those to recover metals from minerals that we haven't processed in the past. So we can expand the potential places that we can get our metals from. And these bugs are really particularly useful for dealing with waste materials that have been already processed, that have already been broken down, that perhaps they've been ground up, and they are problematic waste dumps, but the microbes can be used to help recover the metals and actually clean up the mess that's been left behind. And then there's other colleagues, working in Leicester University, have been looking at using things like deep eutectic solvents. So this a new type of chemistry, really never been used in the minerals industry before. So again, opportunity to particularly get metals out of things like electronic waste and so on. So really useful new technologies that could be brought to the party. And the final good news is, for me, is that as a mineralogist, to bring in this new types of technology, we need to know much more about those materials. And so any thoughts I had of retiring are gone, because I need to kind of get in here and help develop ways of finding those new resources, finding better ways of getting those metals from unconventional wastes, unconventional ore deposits that are sitting there. Perhaps they were left in the ground previously, like in Cornwall, and then we can bring some of those new technologies in there to help. And so the very final word is to say we should be taking the mining industry away from this diagram, which is where the mining workflow was exploration, project, operation, and closure, a kind of a single line where we dig stuff out of the ground and then we leave a hole in the ground with a load of waste and a problem. And what we should do is be switching it into this concept of the circular economy. And I'm robbing this concept from Michael Braungart and William McDonough of Cradle to Cradle, which they applied to manufacturing. And the philosophy behind this is, when you make something, you should have in mind what you're going to do with it when it comes to the end of its life. So you should inherently be reconstructive with whatever you make. And it's the same for mining. We should be making sure that we can extract those minerals and metals, but not leave the legacy of terrible holes in the ground. And we kind of need to get on with that really quickly if we're going to hit that challenge of the 2050 timeline. And so the takeaway messages are: there is a clear need to mine an increased volume of a range of metals to deliver that net zero pledge. But there's no doubt that sourcing has to be done in a way that's net positive. We have to optimize recycling and use of waste as a key component, but it is not enough. So mining is both inevitable and essential, and it's for society to choose where that should happen. We should think about deep ocean versus terrestrial and make those decisions based on science and fact, not emotion, and realise that we've got to hit those targets if we're going to get to net zero. But that mining should follow the cradle to cradle principles that I talked about. And part of that is to bring some of our new metal sourcing to home, because we could be regenerating old districts, having lower impact. And this could drive other societal economic benefits. If we're mining stuff for the new economy, local close to home, the supply chain issue goes out of the door because it's being mined close to home. So we don't have to worry whether the Suez Canal closes down and we can't get our supplies of lithium from Australia, because actually we're getting quite a bit of our lithium from somewhere in Cornwall or somewhere in Finland. So that's the final plea, I would say, is let's think of all of those options. Amazing challenge, but we've got an amazing set of people working on this problem. And I think if we can employ all of these things, we can actually make it work. So thank you very much for listening. A little bit longer than I'd anticipated, but I hope that that has been interesting and entertaining. So thank you.
Well, that's fantastic, Richard. An amazing tour de force of all the issues. And I think listening to it, it seems somewhat overwhelming that there are so many different interdependent variables, and it seems like if you optimize one thing, then something else is going to pop out and become another problem. I suppose one of the things that occurs to me from one of your earlier slides about the amount of materials in production of cars, you made the case very well there that the comparison between a conventional car and an electric car, actually at the manufacturing stage, is not that big a difference. But of course, that presumes that they're both going to be manufactured. And maybe if we didn't manufacture any more cars, then that would be a big slice that you could take out of it. I know there are the practicalities of how long you can possibly keep them going, but maybe being more frugal.
I completely agree with you. You know, I did that calculation and made the assumption that we would swap our 31.5 million internal combustion engine cars for electric vehicles. But actually, now is the time to rethink that, because, I mean, look out on your front door. Your cars are sitting on your drive for so much of their life. Do we all really need a car? If we could get a better way of thinking, how do we what do we need our car for? So it's for transport. So we've got to work out a better way, perhaps. You're absolutely right. Part of us coping with this challenge is to have some rethinking about the way we do things, and there is the opportunity to reduce the number of cars we produce, reduce the size. I mean, we've had car inflation. I mean, you look at things like the Fiat 500 or the Mini. The Mini's increased in size 60+% since it was first brought out. I mean, the Volkswagen Golf started off as quite a small car. It's now quite a big car. I mean, we've got to think about, do we really need things quite so big? Do we need big SUVs? Everyone feels comfortable in them, but they're using far more metal than the old cars we used to drive. They might be safer, but are there better ways of making cars safer than just making them bigger? It's a big. There's lots of opportunities for us to reduce the demand, I think.
And I wonder if there's any possibility, because this is a global thing. It's not one nation can make a sort of a stand, perhaps, but it's really a global thing. I wonder if the world has the capacity to collectively make those sorts of massive decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit worrying. I mean, you kind of need the US to align, and probably if we could get the US and China aligned, big markets.
Yeah. Start big and then work. Yeah.
Then work. All we can do is we can set precedents, though. I think the UK is in a really good position to offer the leadership on thinking in this. And we still are very innovative with our industry. We're heavy hitters. I mean, I don't need to say that to you guys. Our engineers and technologists in the UK do punch well above their weight. So what we can do is lead others to then put those into the bigger markets. And in many ways, it's watching people copy things. I mean, let's face it, the batteries technology was was designed a lot of that was designed by British engineers, and it was just put into massive production by other countries. Maybe there's a chance for us to do both at this time. Although the news today wasn't very good with the Brit Volt.
Yes, I was going to say exactly. The British Volt going into administration is not exactly leading the vanguard in the direction that your presentation leads us to think would be a good idea.
Well, we don't have a government industrial strategy anymore, which I don't like to get political, but I think how can we know what to do if we don't have if the government won't give us a guide on that? Because some of those big things need the government's intervention, don't they? I mean, guidance on making sure things happen, because they need to be joined up. We need to know that the car industry is going to stay here. They need batteries. And then we can actually say to the people in Cornwall, yeah, provide us some lithium for those batteries. But you see, I can see now with the no battery factory, the pressure, the government then won't put money into bringing the mining on in Cornwall. So it's kind of knock on if we don't get all of those things lined up. You're absolutely right. It can't just be done out. No single group can bring this off. We have to collectively tackle this as a problem.
Yes, I can certainly. I can see both sides of the argument, that from the politicians' point of view, that they have to worry about what's happening today and the energy crisis and everything else today that people are suffering, and suffering in the future is something for their successors probably. So I can sort of see both the need for long-term thinking and also the need for short-term action, and it's not a time to be a politician, because you criticise for whichever direction you try to push, I think. But
no, exactly.
Always the way when there's a recession, that when times are good, nobody complains, and when times are bad, everybody complains.
Exactly. Yeah, it's good to be opposition, isn't it, when in bad times?
Yes, although I'm not sure necessarily the opposition would have I don't think anybody would have an easy ride at the moment. Yeah. So it's in some ways more comfortable not to have your hand on the controller. But anyway, I was wondering also what you thought about the idea of making, again topical, making materials in space, or making. We had just a week or so ago the unfortunately unsuccessful launch of the satellites from the spaceport in Cornwall again.
Yep.
Becoming very popular. I think we should buy shares in Cornwall at the moment.
Yeah, well,
and one of the things that was supposed to be on that mission was a trial for making materials in space, manufacturing silicon wafers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is that something that is remotely possible to do at scale, do you think?
Well, I mean, undoubtedly we will, but it's accelerating those things to becoming industrial. Putting things at scale is the issue. I mean, I work, as probably you guys all do, in looking at the technologically readiness level, TRL, of a particular thing, and a lot of those space things are very low TRLs at the moment, and they need a lot of investment to push them on, and I'm sure they will get there, but it's the timing. It's always the timing of delivery. I mean, what encouraged me over the COVID period is how quickly if we do push things, we can get things done. But it needs a collective thought, which we did have for COVID because everybody shared the crisis. I think we need to feel that this same challenge we've got at the moment is such a crisis that the whole world needs to tackle it. But of course, it's come at the moment where we're a bit fragmented with a war going on, and that doesn't help us join things up either. So,
yes, indeed. what I'm going to do is bring in my colleague Richard, and
hello. Excellent.
Richard's been monitoring the questions that have been submitted online. And I have to say, I think probably the largest number of questions that I can remember from one of the talks.
It's been going pretty crazy in the Q&A. So thank you everybody who's submitted a question, and we'll get the apology in advance that we're not going to be able to cover all of them, but there are some common themes there, and I think, if I may, Richard, I'm going to start with the elephant in the room. So you told us an awful lot about minerals on the Earth. There is, of course, an elephant in the room, the universe's most abundant element, our friend hydrogen. Lots of people have been asking about hydrogen. Where do you think that fits into the grand scheme of things, and what sort of impact can it have? All sorts of things have been promised, and nobody really knows. Yeah,
well, I mean, number one, I think nuclear fusion, we didn't talk about that either. For the energy, it seems like we've got some glimmers of hope of that, haven't we? So that's one thing to talk about that we didn't sort of mention. But yeah, hydrogen definitely part of it. You know, for personal vehicles, we're going on battery, electric, recharged, but you know, for big, I mean, things like shipping, for airliners, hydrogen offers us an enormous chance with fuel cells to deliver, particularly for, you know, trains, for example. Trucks, when you need a rapid turnaround and you can't recharge, it just makes a lot of sense for those to be hydrogen vehicles. And I think that's, for me, that sort of heavy transport is going to go to that, or ammonia, which is sort of like hydrogen, but less
scary. Yeah.
Less scary form of hydrogen. But obviously ammonia has got its own issues. People are worried about it environmentally. But yeah, I think there is a big room for that. And of course, that uses platinum. You need catalysts for that, and platinum is one of those that's used in fuel cells. So we've got that's another mined metal. So so what you're doing is you're transferring, and obviously for hydrogen, we need our hydrogen to be green. So we're probably going to have far more energy. We're going to have to generate more electricity if we go to hydrogen-based economy. So that means more power stations. So that means more other metals. So although hydrogen's your answer as the fuel, making that fuel will need the big infrastructure to turn something in like water into hydrogen. It will take energy. Now, if we crack nuclear fusion and we can use hydrogen, a lot of those metals could go away. And, you know, maybe 10 years from now, someone will give a talk and go, do you remember that talk about that guy or that metal? We don't need them. Well, it might be the case if nuclear fusion takes off and we move to a hydrogen, because we've got so much cheap energy, then I think that could be a way forward. So I think there is a big place for hydrogen in this whole
Excellent.
mix.
Thank you for those thoughts. So somebody's just popped into the chat a reminder that the IET, in fact, several IET local networks over the last year and a bit have done talks on the hydrogen-powered train, which is a thing called Hydroflex. Right. So I think if you look at the various IET local network YouTube channels or do web searches, there's lots of information about the Hydroflex train out there, which is very, very fascinating.
Okay, great. No, so look at that.
I was very intrigued by your smorgasbord of flavours on the periodic table, and to be honest, I quite like crosswords, but I'd really struggle to name most of the elements that you'd given the symbols of there. And are people using these what you might call more exotic materials for good reason, do you think, or is it just because they're there, or is there some other reason why they've suddenly taken on a popularity?
I guess some of them are used quite a lot as sort of exciters of phosphors in for example, in LEDs and so on. So some of them are used in really, really tiny amounts. It's quite true, and it could well be for those kind of photoelectric properties. But you know, others are finding some incredible. I mean, scandium is one of those that's kind of, we haven't talked about that. That's a metal that's bubbling under, and if we industrialize the production of that could go crazy. So at the moment, it has a very minor use, but it could be used for hardening aluminium and to produce alloys that are better than carbon fiber. Really, at the moment, carbon fiber is cheaper than an aluminium scandium alloy. But if it was industrialized, but I think some of those are very, very niche. Some of the rare earths are used in magnets in very small amounts, just really to tickle the electric magnetic properties of alloys. So quite minor, but yeah, I mean, some of them are becoming sort of much more industrially used.
And do you think rather than metals, polymers might be an alternative?
They could be. And there has been an argument about can we produce polymers to do a lot of these, but it's the polymer production, hydrocarbons. It's getting back to using something. It's an alternative, but it's still going to be a mined or a mined resource. I mean, if you do things with metals right, you can, because metals don't get destroyed. You know, they can reuse them. You can a polymer. Then you have to deconstruct and reconstruct. It's a trickier thing to go back to the monomer from a polymer, isn't it? I mean, there are projects that have done that, but with metals, to make an alloy, to go back to the metal is potentially, there's an easier chemical route.
That's an interesting observation. Yeah. Richard, have you got another one from the questions?
Yeah, so apologies if I dropped out for a minute. My headset decided to pick now to start misbehaving. So we've got a couple of questions on alternatives for some of the materials in our batteries. Obviously, lithium is headline news at the moment. There's talk of, I think, Tesla of going cobalt-free with their lithium iron phosphate battery, and there are various people looking at sodium-ion batteries instead. What's your view on where battery technology may be going?
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, there's a whole bunch of technologies out there that are to be used, but again, the lead time on those is 5 years probably. And you know what manufacturers are like? They don't like uncertainties. They'll go for things. If you remember Betamax versus VHS, I think everyone thought Betamax was far better than VHS, but VHS was easier to produce for whatever reason, and people went for it. And I think certainly for the energy, the high-end energy, we're going to be stuck with lithium because we want light batteries. So sodium, of course, is just heavier. Lithium's like element 3, so it's the lightest, and just that for that reason, I think we're not going to get rid of lithium. The cocktail of other metals could be different. That's quite true. So cobalt's being reduced, but then you put more nickel in, and then you might use a bit of manganese, but manganese is very abundant. So there will be tweaks on that chemistry, but at the moment, you know, NMC, cobalt, manganese, and nickel is like the best cocktail for the high-end cars that are being produced at the moment. And it's just simply if you like, the charge to weight ratio and the ability to deliver that charge back to the motor that's driven us that way. If it's for a bus, then, you know, lithium phosphate batteries are quite good because you don't need to have buses going 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. So it's like horses for courses. But I do think manufacturers have made their decisions, and they don't want to ship a product that's not been tried and tested. You remember Samsung had issues with their phone. I mean, even Boeing had a problem with the battery in their 777s when they first came out. Manufacturers are quite conservative with technologies that they produce at scale. So my feeling is it's going to be 5 years before we see a move away from lithium at all. and it might well be 10 years. But then, of course, you've already produced batteries and you've got a whole load of stuff that you can recycle. So if you get the recycling right, then we might just stick with a technology that does the job and is easy to recycle, rather than just going for the best every time, because that's the sheer way of not making a circular economy. If you keep changing your technology, think what happened when we went from flint to iron. There's a lot of flint lying around that nobody uses anymore. It'd be interesting if we stuck with flint for knives or whatever. No, I mean, there are certainly going to be benefits to going to other technologies, but my feeling is that once we've got stocks of these things, there'll be more pressure to reuse what we've mined. So I think we'll stick with lithium batteries for quite a long time.
Great, thank you.
Where shall we go next, Richard? There's so many different themes coming in.
Yeah, I mean, we got a question here. I think, a lot of people think that nuclear, needs to be ramped up. Obviously, creating new nuclear power stations does take an enormous amount of time. What about the world's stockpile of uranium, either processed or ready to mine? How much is there? How much can we actually use, do you think?
Yeah, I think that nuclear is from a personal point of view, I think it should be part of the mix, because we really do need a base load power supply. And for the UK, nuclear is an obvious option, because, we can build our nuclear power stations we've done it successfully, building them on the coast. And, I don't want to tempt fate here, but actually the power stations themselves haven't been the issue. It's the nuclear waste. And I think we need to tackle that. But every one of these technologies that I've talked about, and there's a downside to it, because it's an intervention. And I think it's can we find a way to deal with our nuclear waste? And if we can, then I would say nuclear has a big future. Although I saw today, again, announcement from Davos there that I forget which the company is, but they can't wait for the government to make its mind up on these new nuclear power plants. They've got to build them in France now. So we're vacillating here on decisions on nuclear. So I think for me, it should be part of the mix. But we need to be firm, have some government decisions on what we're going to do with nuclear waste, and make sure we build something for the future for that very purpose.
Yeah. Thinking of that, I wonder if there might be a place for something like we're very keen on labelling. Houses have labels for energy efficiency, and products have ratings and so on. I wonder if there's a case for having a kind of index that would objectively measure the impact of the materials in a given product, so that you could compare phone A with phone B, for example, and see what the material impact of one was versus the other, to help inform your decision. Is that at all practical, do you think, or are the materials just so many different components and that it wouldn't really be practical?
I think it's a great idea, because if you're understanding the what you've got, a bit like when you pick up a food product, you've got a whole list of things, haven't you, that's in it, and I think we've got to connect people with the products they use. So getting that information would be really useful. I've talked to the group Fairphone, who make the Fairphone, as you might well have heard of that. They find it enormously difficult, because they want to do that. They find it enormously difficult to track all of the components or the materials that go into their phones. So even they are finding it tough to track where they come from. But I do think this is where the government could actually help by insisting that that companies declare what's in there, and where it is. So that, again, that will help recycling if we know in the phone what's in there and where the components are.
And Apple have finally given in to the European drive for being able to do self-repairs. So I suppose that's partly the answer to how to reduce overconsumption by consuming components for repairs rather than consuming whole products over and over again. But
well, yeah, I mean, it's like a laptop. You know, if you can change the gubbing, I mean, the keyboard could last a long time. You know, particularly, I had a Mac for many years, and the keyboard didn't pack up. It became obsolete because they didn't update the software, and I couldn't change some components. And the actual case was fine. And you think, well, why couldn't I just have some new gizmos in the back and just swap those, but keep quite a lot of the component rather than have to send the whole thing back? And I think we need to move to that. And almost like a car, if it's a good chassis, why can't we just put a new body on it and put do different type of battery inside, take the old ones out and put build things in that way that they could be deconstructed and reconstructed rather than because recycling, again, you're going to have to use energy. Reusing would be really good, wouldn't it? And if you could, because certain components you could just keep reusing if it was built well.
Richard?
I'm just wondering when we're heading rapidly to 9 o'clock. We
yes,
have got a few questions to go.
Maybe a couple of themes, and then we'll.
I mean, I think you did touch on this during your talk, Richard. But the huge amounts of water required in processing these ores and things. How can we reduce that, or are we running up against sort of physical limits, that there is a limit to how much we can reduce things?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good one. I saw that there because my colleague Robin Armstrong talks about this he calls it the copper crunch, because what's happening is with the copper we're finding is the grade of the ore is getting lower and lower, so we're having to grind more rock, we're having to use more stuff and water. Particularly we find copper in Chile where there isn't much water, so it's like people are working on, can we do dry processing? And I think this is where we've got to. We haven't had many technological increase in steps forward in mineral processing technology for a long time. We're overdue. We don't have enough people working on metallurgy, in my view, on those metals. We used to have a lot of people working on mineral processing. We don't train any mining engineers anymore, and I think we need to be doing that. I think this technology of using things like deep eutectic solvents might help a little bit, but it's the grinding of large volumes of rock. So if we got a copper ore, might be less than 1% copper. So effectively, you're mining 100 tons of rock to get 1 ton of copper, and so that is very well. It's not even that amount, but it's a lot of, if you like, rock that has to be crushed and ground in water, and to get that little bit of copper out, must be a different way of breaking the rock, perhaps, or so it needs something like that. Big paradigm shift in processing. I think.
Definitely, thank you.
Wow, I think that's an amazing range and scope on the topic, Richard. I think it's been a very interesting and thought-provoking talk that you've brought to us this evening, and something that is going to give us all, as we go back to work tomorrow, certainly those of us that are in manufacturing or in design, there is an impact to everything, I think is the bottom line to what you have been telling us about, and working out what that is in the most optimum way for the materials is something that we can't just assume materials are going to be there in the future.
No, it is, and I think we all need to be a part of this discussion, and we have to hit it from the consumer side. What is it we really do need, and then we should be part of the decision making on where those materials come from. And we can't treat these things like something you go down to the shop and buy, and not ever thinking about where they come from. I mean, we've changed with food. We're actually quite mature the way we buy food these days, aren't we? We want to make sure that it's healthy, and we want to know where it's come from. We should feel the same about the materials that we use, those minerals and think we should know whether our phone is using recycled materials, or is it all pristine? Is it coming from the DRC or China? Because with that information, then we can make much more rational choices. And as consumers, we can start to put pressures on the manufacturers and say, we're not going to buy your products if you don't tell us where this is coming from, and so on. So I think that, but people need to be, I don't want to use the word educated, but people need to find out where all of these things from, question where they're coming from, and go and find out. And then we should be providing that information.
So I'm just looking at a few of the reactions that have come back from the audience, and the comments like, many thanks, lots to think about. I think that's certainly true. And I saw early on that someone said it's one of the best presentations they've ever seen. So as a virtual appreciation from the audience tonight, thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to us, Richard. And hopefully we can invite you back to get part 2 of the discussion a few years from now and see where we've actually got to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it definitely would be good. I mean, I'm constantly monitoring where we are, because obviously from 2019, it's only been 4 years now, but we've seen such big changes actually in the way the approaches and people's attitudes. And I thought when in 2021, when I wrote the paper saying, we should be bringing mining back closer to home, I thought I'd get lambasted, but actually people are now thinking, well, that's not a bad idea, because for all of these reasons, particularly when we've had supply chain issues, if you're mining it on your doorstep, you can secure where it's coming from. So yeah, it'd be good. I'm more than happy to come back and do a reprise at some point. And please feel free, if you've got other questions that you feel haven't been answered. I'm happy to take email for people, for questions. So.
That's very kind, Richard.
And also, the slides. People asked about the slides. I'm happy to make those available. Perhaps I can send those through to you, Nigel. And
yes, we'll endeavour to put those on our website. Where, incidentally, if anyone would like the CPD certificate for this evening's event, it's the iet.org/Surrey, so it's pretty easy to remember. I'll pop that in the chat in a moment.